Throughout our daily life, we'll come across strangers, and sometimes we'll make an attempt at communication with strangers, even if it's just simply passing another person by. We'll have some thoughts about this person, whether it be positive or negative, but the truth is, we'll never know what secrets truly hide behind this person. In Mexico City, a mother of three would make an assumption on a stranger that would forever change her life for the worst, and would even lead to some of the most degrading torture committed by the stranger. The person who would commit these acts of torture would later be sentenced to 241 years in prison. Good morning, good afternoon, or perhaps good night. In my case, it's a good night. Very quickly, I want to throw out a viewer discretion out there, as this case is very disturbing. There will be some mentions of SA, assault, manipulation, and torture. If those are unsettling for you, please click off this video, and that is a warning. I also want to note, this is my first time doing a video like this. I want to keep the format simple and factual. I attempted my best to find research for this whole entire video. If any misinformation pops up, please let me know in the comments. Anyways, let's find out who this monster is in Mexico City. What did he do to deserve 241 years in prison? Claudia Tapia Herrera was a mother of three and had been working a cleaning job at a furniture store when a man she thought at the time as charming and caring had caught her interest. She thought she would get everything she ever needed in life from this man, Jorge Iniestra Salas, who worked as a security guard there. From an evaluation that comes from CNDH, or in English, Natural Human Rights Commission, Claudia quotes that Jorge would say, "You tell me, ñoña, and I will give you good advice." If I mispronounce the word ñoña, I'm sorry, and my pronunciation isn't the best. Anyway, that word I mispronounced is basically a nickname that Jorge would use for Claudia. She found Jorge at the time as a source of comfort. Now, considering this is both the start of the video, what the name of the video is, everything that comes from this relationship is one of the most sinister and vile cases I have ever come across. After the two had started going out together, Jorge moved into Claudia's household just after 3 months with her two daughters, who were Rebecca, 12 years of age, Gabriela, who was 15, and her son Ricardo, who was 11. Very early in this relationship, Jorge was like a wolf in sheep's clothing. Claudia admired this man and was just charmed. Jorge would even buy the children gifts. Now, some background on Claudia. Claudia had just supposedly gotten out of an abusive relationship, and she comes from a household that traumatized her. Claudia had 2 previous relationships before she had met Jorge. Her first relationship was with a man who avoided the responsibility of being the father of her oldest daughter. Her second relationship, she birthed her 2 youngest children. The man from this relationship was an alcoholic and would often abuse Claudia. Soon, he would immigrate to the United States for work. Claudia didn't have the best history with the men in her relationships before, so Claudia meets this guy, Jorge, at one of her jobs she's working at, and she thinks that this could be the sense of comfort she was longing for. However, the cracks in this relationship begin to show, mostly stemming from Jorge's jealousy. At the time, Claudia was working as a janitor in a school, and she would often talk to men she worked with. This made Jorge very jealous. Jorge would talk about his jealousy in a very violent way. Jorge said that he could kill anyone. This threat caused Claudia to avoid contact with most people in her life. But at the same time, Claudia had this idea in her head that Jorge was sort of this alpha male who was right about everything. It even took control of Claudia's finances, and she still thought everything was normal about a relationship. Jorge would soon abuse the kids, physically and verbally. This complete 180 of a change of character took Claudia by surprise. But it wasn't until a night in 2005 where something horrific had taken place, when Claudia had seen Jorge sexually assaulting Rebecca, who was only 12 at the time, and the oldest daughter, Gabriella, watched in horror. Claudia had been too fearful to do anything, as Jorge had previously threatened her in this awful relationship. Afterwards, Jorge would begin justifying his disgusting actions, saying that this is normal from where he comes from, and also was cited to say that he can do this because he comes from a middle-class family. Jorge would use this excuse that since he came from a middle-class family, somehow he was superior to Claudia, who came from a poorer family. Obviously, Jorge is a twisted man, but what follows is terrible. He convinces Claudia to let him be part of a relationship with both Claudia and her 2 daughters. Jorge would attempt to justify his actions by saying he had a friend who committed a similar act, and when the victims tried to explain to the police simply didn't do anything. Claudia, full of fear, was powerless by Jorge's sick power fantasy over her, and her family couldn't do nothing at the time and just endure all of this abuse. Jorge was in total control of Claudia's family now. He would share a room with the 2 daughters and force Claudia and her son to live in the living room. The room Jorge had shared with Claudia's 2 daughters, he would commit unspeakable acts on them for days on end. Jorge would soon force the young son Ricardo to quit school, to sell candy on the streets and make money. If Ricardo didn't make enough money to Jorge's quota, he would be beaten. As well as Ricardo being forced to work and meet a quota, Claudia had been told to do the same, but she would collect cardboard on the streets for recycling and had to meet this quota of money in order to avoid punishment. What's sick about all this, I can't even fathom the pain this family went through. The house they stayed at was terrible. Trash had filled the floors and a terrible smell lurked the house. How could Claudia keep letting this man torment her family? The threats Jorge kept saying terrified her, and it's true, the law enforcement often turns a blind eye to cases like this in Mexico, but Jorge kept convincing her that this was all normal. Jorge grew paranoid of outside influences on the 2 daughters, so he would cover the windows with sheets. He would justify this by saying he was only looking out for their well-being. With the constant sexual abuse Jorge had committed on Claudia's daughters, one of them would give birth. Before this, Jorge wouldn't even allow Claudia to see her own daughters, but now he would, with one condition. That condition being, she had to give Jorge the money she earned while working as a janitor at a school, 6,000 pesos, or the rough equivalent of 335 American dollars. Claudia would look for other forms of employment. Rather than selling cardboard, she would sell used items and junk at a flea market, just to see her own daughters, and now her granddaughter. Jorge had made a twisted sort of game with a 100-point system. Both Claudia and her son. Keep in mind, Ricardo is only 11 at this time, so both Claudia and Ricardo needed to earn 100 points in order to see Gabriella and Rebecca, and if they disobeyed Jorge in any way, they would lose points. You might be asking yourself, what is Jorge doing with all this money he's getting from Ricardo and Claudia? Well, he decides to buy a taxi and work as a taxi driver. You might also be asking yourself, how is no one noticing the disappearance of the children from the school? Well, they were. With Claudia's income from her janitorial job, selling cardboard, and selling used items at a flea market, all of her money was taken by Jorge. She needed to find a way to eat, and she did by taking leftover trash from the school she worked at, and people of the faculty did notice this. A witness by the name of Jose, who worked at the school, told authorities to investigate this, because why would someone in employment with a stable source of income would need to do this? Jorge had feared this moment would come and justice would take place. However, it did not, and in 2009, Jorge quickly relocated the two daughters of Claudia and their baby, unsurprisingly, without Claudia's consent. He left both Claudia and her son Ricardo in the dark about information regarding Gabrielle and Rebecca. Jorge would kidnap the two daughters to his own mother's house, where 19 relatives of Jorge's lived, and all of his family acknowledged all the acts committed by Jorge. We're all aware of his crimes. Despite all of this, Jorge's families would assist him in his crimes. The only time Jorge would contact Claudia was for money, and in exchange for the money, he would give her information regarding how Rebecca and Gabriella were doing. During these exchanges, Jorge would threaten Claudia by saying things such as, "If you go to law enforcement, I will kill you and your daughters." So despite not living with Jorge anymore, Claudia still lived in fear for herself and her daughters. Jorge had kept this going for 2 years until 2011, and in between this time, some events occurred. A majority of Jorge's family was now accomplices to this monstrous crusade of his twisted power fantasy, and would help him in covering up his crimes. One of the most disgusting things Jorge did was saving a semen in a jar, in which he would later force the daughters to drink. As before, Jorge now had these daughters imprisoned in one room. He wouldn't even allow them to use the bathroom. He would have these buckets in the room and force them to use the restroom there. He wouldn't even take the buckets outside once they were full. He let these buckets sit in the room, and an awful smell grew. Jorge wouldn't even allow Rebecca and Gabriella to look outside the window. One day in 2009, he had caught Rebecca attempting to escape through the window against Jorge's orders. So Jorge beat her to death, repeatedly with a stick. Now panic had set within Jorge. He tried something with the baby of one of the daughters by placing it on top of Rebecca as an attempt to revive her, but out of panic, he suffocated the 3-month-old baby. In a desperate attempt to hide the bodies, he placed both corpses in a garbage bag and hid the garbage bag under the mattress until it had started to smell rotten. He would try to cover up the smell by putting lemon juice on top of it, but it didn't do nothing. So with no last options, he had asked a relative for help to hide the bodies. So they took the bodies to the Mexico-Puebla highway and tossed the bodies off the side of the road. After a few days later, Mexican law enforcement would discover the bags that held the bodies and would open up an investigation, but the bodies could not be identified since the minors were not yet registered into the system. This caused the investigation to be at a standstill until later. Rebecca and her baby were not yet registered into any source of hospital records, so this made the whole entire situation very difficult for law enforcement to identify these corpses that were found in this bag off the side of the road. In 2011, Claudia would finally make an attempt to bring Jorge's crimes to light with the support of her sister, but to no avail. The first law enforcement agency she had contacted with her sister simply did not believe her, mostly due to the lack of evidence. They would question her. How could you let something like this happen to your whole entire family for so many years? And where's the evidence? 3 months this had gone on, where law agencies would just deny her claims. But Claudia had this brilliant idea to write out a timeline of events, describing everything in detail that had happened under Jorge's torment. This timeline of events she wrote was 22 pages and in great detail. So Claudia and her sister took these papers to a law enforcement agency where they finally believed her because of how descriptive these papers were. And finally, some months later, a prosecutor summoned her appearance to court. Justice would finally be served to Jorge. Jorge was soon after apprehended. During this court meeting, a lot of news outlets had gathered. Jorge was there alongside his accomplices, his family, and including his mother. Throughout this whole entire court case, his mother would defend the actions of Jorge. Jorge had confessed to the murder of Rebecca and the 3-month-old baby, finally putting the case from earlier to an end. With Jorge's confession, Claudia was shocked because she didn't know that he had murdered Rebecca. During Jorge's arrest, he confessed to many other things, and throughout the whole entire time, he held a cynical behavior, even laughing while describing events. Jorge would say everything had happened because Claudia had this fantasy of Jorge dominating her family, and that he was just fulfilling it.
Quizás por eso al ser arrestado se burlaba, se reía y hasta ironizaba.
10 preguntas a la vez no se puede.
Por otro lado,
nos conocemos y con ella empieza la fantasía. Ella me lleva a conocer a sus hijas para que la fantasía pues pueda seguir explotada a otros niveles.
He had tried to put Claudia as the one to blame. All while Jorge is confessing to these crimes, Claudia is just seated nearby, between one person.
Finalmente, Antonio Iniestra acabó con la vida de Rebeca, su hijastra, y Leslie, su propia hija.
Claudia meanwhile is crying and asserting her innocence, saying that she was manipulated by Jorge and was in constant fear of the threats he made. Jorge was later sentenced to 241 years in prison for all the crimes he committed, and as well, Jorge's accomplices were sent to prison for around 20 years, including his mother. Claudia was originally going to be in prison for many years, but in 2015, she was released after many psychological evaluations. And that day, Jorge was named the Monster of Iztapalapa. During an evaluation from Jorge, I wasn't able to find very much about this, but the thing I did find was Jorge was able to tell right from wrong, meaning he couldn't plead insanity and knew everything he was doing and was in complete control. He confessed everything without any remorse. While Jorge and his accomplices were arrested, the police would go search the house of his mother's and find everything in almost like a decaying state, like the buckets full of excrement and the semen jars, and everything there was filthy, like it was somehow a torture house, which it literally was. Thankfully, the remaining victims, including Gabriella and her daughters, were found and rescued. One thing I want to go over very quickly is regarding the release of Claudia. Obviously, a parent should want to uphold the well-being of their child higher than anything else. So why did Claudia allow this abuse to go on so long? In 2011, Claudia would be arrested alongside Jorge and his family for allowing the abuse of her children. In 2015, an evaluation was conducted by 2 experts that would overgo Claudia's psyche. In this evaluation, it was found that Claudia had the battered woman syndrome. Battered woman syndrome, which is the result of long-term abuse, can make the victim of the syndrome believe that they deserve this abuse, and it would distort their conception of reality. After this evaluation, Claudia would be acquitted of the crimes she was charged with and was able to live as a free woman in 2015. As for Jorge, he would rot in prison for 241 years, or until his death, as he admitted to all of his crimes in a very cynical fashion and would even joke about all the horrible things he did. One thing I did want to mention, but I couldn't find too much about this, was that Gabriella, Claudia's only surviving daughter, would develop Stockholm Syndrome, and during the court case, Gabriella would even defend Jorge. So that is the case of the monster of Iztapalapa and all the horrible actions he had committed. Obviously, it's very easy to want to put blame on the mother, but this man Jorge was a very sick and twisted individual who had gripped Claudia into believing everything he did was right. I personally do believe that the mother in the situation does have some fault, but it's very easy to misunderstand trauma and what exactly is going on in the brain of someone. With that being said, this was the case of the monster of Iztapalapa, and if you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. And if you enjoyed this type of content I did this video, please let me know in the comments. With that being said, I'll see you all later.